Before Jesus performed his first miracle, John the Baptist was already imprisoned. Before the crucifixion, before the resurrection, before anything the world would call redemption, a man rotted in a dungeon on the shores of the Dead Sea, waiting for an execution he knew was coming. What happened in that cell and what happened afterward changes everything you think you know about faith, silence, and divine justice. There is a kind of story that time cannot digest, a story that always returns, that never resolves, that keeps disturbing centuries later because it touches something no theology can completely anesthetize, the feeling that those who should be protected are the first to be destroyed, that those who speak the truth are the first to pay the price of having spoken it. That power has a very convenient selective memory for those who wield it and an absolutely relentless memory for those who question it. The story of John the Baptist is exactly that. And to understand why it still disturbs, why artists painted it for 2 millennia, and writers rewrote it, and theologians debated it without ever reaching a satisfying resolution, you need to start at the beginning. Not with the banquet, not with the dance, not with the head on a silver platter. You need to start with the desert. There was a man in the Judean desert, approximately 30 kilometers east of Jerusalem, wearing clothing of camel's hair, bound at the waist with a leather belt, eating locusts and wild honey. This was not symbolism. It was not a cultural performance calculated for an audience. It was the real life of someone who had chosen to live completely outside all the comfort systems available in first-century Palestine. The text of Matthew chapter 3 verse 4 records these details with a specificity that scholars of gospel historicity treat as a marker of authenticity. When an ancient source preserves prosaic and uncomfortable details rather than merely heroic and grand ones, the methodological tendency is that those details exist because they are true. Nobody invents an insect diet for the hero of the story. John the Baptist was approximately 6 months older than Jesus, if you follow the chronology carefully constructed by Luke in chapter 1 of his Gospel. Son of Zechariah, an elderly priest belonging to the priestly class of Abijah, one of the 24 groups of priests who took turns serving in the Jerusalem temple according to the system established by David in 1 Chronicles chapter 24. And of Elizabeth, described as belonging also to the daughters of Aaron and as a relative of Mary, the mother of Jesus. The Greek text uses the word syngenis, which can mean close relative or family member. The birth of John was marked by something the text describes as extraordinary, even within a context where the extraordinary was the constant backdrop. Zechariah had entered the holy place to burn incense on a day determined by lot, and you need to understand what that meant in the priestly context of the first century. The Jerusalem temple operated with a system of shifts of priests who rotated on specific weeks of the year. Within each shift, the duties were drawn by lot daily. The duty of entering the holy place to burn incense at the golden altar, which stood directly before the veil separating the rest from the most holy place, was one of the most sacred. And, given the volume of available priests and the frequency of the lots, it was possible for a priest to spend his entire life without ever being drawn for that function. It was a once-in-a-lifetime event, if it happened at all. For many, it never happened. Zechariah was drawn. He entered the holy place, and within that space of approximately 10 meters in length by 5 in width, incensed and solemnly sacred, he received a message that his elderly wife, who had spent her entire life unable to have children, an immense social burden in a context where female infertility was interpreted as a sign of divine displeasure. As the very text of Luke chapter 1, verse 25 indicates, when Elizabeth says that God had taken away her reproach among men, would become pregnant, Zechariah doubted. Luke chapter 1, verse 18 records the question, "How shall I know this? For I am old, and my wife is well advanced in years." It was a reasonable question from a human standpoint. It was also the question that cost Zechariah his voice for 9 full months. He was mute until the birth of his son, unable to utter any word while the prophecy he had received unfolded in human form within Elizabeth's womb. And when John was born, when the relatives and neighbors came to rejoice with Elizabeth and wanted to call the child Zechariah, after the father, the text says the mother intervened. No, he shall be called John. When they consulted Zechariah by a written sign, he wrote the same. His name is John, and immediately his mouth was opened, his tongue was loosed, and he spoke, not words of everyday gratitude, but a prophecy. The Benedictus, as it became known in the liturgical tradition, recorded in Luke chapter 1, verses 68 to 79, and which ends with the words addressed directly to the newborn son. And you, child, will be called the prophet of the Most High, for you will go before the Lord to prepare his ways. There is a specific pressure that this kind of origin places on a child. Not in the abstract and pious sense, but in the concrete and psychological sense that anyone who has grown up carrying the extraordinary expectations of others immediately recognizes. John grew up with a father who had spent 9 months in forced silence after questioning a divine promise. What did that teach about the seriousness of the calling? With a mother who had carried decades of social stigma for infertility and who saw in him the resolution of a public humiliation, what weight did that place on the son's shoulders? With neighbors who knew the miraculous story of his birth and watched to see what that child would become. In a cultural context where the role of a priest's son was mapped and determined before birth, the priestly inheritance passed from father to son, and in this specific case, there was a prophecy pointing toward a destiny that lay beyond the walls of the temple. The Gospels do not preserve John's intermediate years. Luke chapter 1, verse 80 says only that the child grew and became strong in spirit and was in the deserts until the day of his public appearance to Israel. One verse, for 30 years of life. From the miraculous birth to the public appearance in the Judean desert, there is a gap the text does not fill and which historiography can only fill with probabilities and contexts. What happened during those 30 years is territory for speculation, but not empty speculation. There is a specific historical context that makes intelligible what John became. In the very desert where John appears, in the region of the Dead Sea, in Judea, there existed in this period a community of Jews living in monastic retreat, whose writings were discovered in 1947 by a Bedouin shepherd who threw a stone into a cave and heard the sound of breaking pottery. The Dead Sea Scrolls, found in the caves of Qumran, revealed the existence of a group, identified by most scholars as Essenes, though there is debate about this, who had withdrawn from corrupt Jerusalem to live in purity in the desert, awaiting the end of times and divine intervention in history. These groups practiced ritual purification baptisms, which is relevant to understanding John's later ministry. They lived in communities separated from the world, studied the prophetic texts with obsessive intensity, copied the scriptures. The copies found at Qumran are the oldest Hebrew biblical manuscripts we have, 1,000 years older than those that existed before the discovery, and awaited 2 messiahs, one priestly and one royal. John may or may not have had contact with Qumran or similar groups. The texts do not say, but the context makes clear that he did not emerge in a vacuum, that there was a specific cultural and spiritual environment in first-century Palestine that made intelligible the kind of message he carried, and that the message of repentance, of purification baptism, of eschatological urgency, of criticism of corrupt priests, was a language that resonated in a specific code of that historical moment. Among a specific group of people who were fed up with what the Jerusalem temple had become, the message was direct. frighteningly direct for a context in which religious power and political power had fused into a web of interdependencies that made any criticism of one also a threat to the other. John preached repentance. He baptized people in the Jordan River as a sign of purification and turning of life. And he said, without hesitation, without degrees in strategic communication, without image consultants, that the time was short, that the axe was already laid at the root of the trees, that every tree that did not produce good fruit would be cut down and thrown into the fire. Matthew chapter 3, verses 7 to 12. It was not a Sunday comfort message. It was a message of urgency and judgment that created discomfort in exactly the right places. What made John particularly uncomfortable was not only the content of the message, but its precise address. When Pharisees and Sadducees, the two groups that dominated the religious and institutional life of Judaism at the time, adversaries in many respects, but allies in the common interest of maintaining the status quo that benefited them, went to the Jordan to be baptized, John called them a brood of vipers. He did not receive them with the satisfaction of seeing religious leaders adopting his practice. He did not greet them as potential allies. He attacked them with language that left no room for misinterpretation. He said that it was useless to invoke Abraham as father if the works did not correspond, that the examiner who was coming had the winnowing fan in his hand to separate the wheat from the chaff, and that the chaff would be burned in a fire that never goes out. It was the kind of speech that makes no friends in the right places, and the crowds went to him. This is fundamental to understanding everything that follows. They did not go to the Jerusalem temple with its architecture that left visitors breathless. Herod the Great had rebuilt the temple on a monumental scale that even the Romans admired, with foundation stones that modern archaeologists have identified with dimensions of up to 12 meters in length, 4 in height and 3 in width, weighing hundreds of tons. They did not go to that structure with its established priestly hierarchy, its codified rituals, its system of charges and fees and currency exchange. They went to a man in the desert wearing animal clothing and eating insects. Mark chapter 1 verse 5 says that all the province of Judea and all those of Jerusalem went out to him and were all baptized by him in the Jordan River. The language is hyperbole, as was common in ancient writing to indicate mass movement. But the historical datum the text points to is real. John's movement was a significant social phenomenon, relevant enough to attract attention not only from common populations, but inevitably from the temple guards, the scribes, the Pharisees, the Herodians, and Herod Antipas's own palace. There was also something in John's behavior toward Jesus that the texts record with an emphasis indicating its importance. When Jesus arrived at the Jordan to be baptized, John recognized who he was. John chapter 1, verse 29 records that when John saw Jesus approaching, he said, "Behold the Lamb of God, who takes away the sin of the world." And when Jesus asked to be baptized, John tried to prevent it, saying that it was he who needed to be baptized by Jesus. Matthew chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. There was a clear awareness of spiritual hierarchy in that interaction. John knew his role relative to that of Jesus, but there was also something more human and more moving. When John immersed Jesus in the waters of the Jordan, and he came up, the Gospels describe an experience that John witnessed. Matthew chapter 3, verses 16 and 17 records that the heavens opened. The Spirit of God descended in the form of a dove, and a voice said, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased." John was a witness to that moment, and then he was imprisoned. To understand what happens next, you need to understand who Herod Antipas was, not Herod the Great, the obsessive builder of fortresses and palaces and temples, who had his own sons killed on suspicion of conspiracy and who died of a disease that modern historians have tried to diagnose retrospectively, with suggestions ranging from chronic renal failure to Fournier's gangrene, around the year 4 before the Common Era. Herod Antipas was his son, born of Malthace, a Samaritan woman who was one of Herod the Great's 10 documented wives, who had at least 5 sons who survived into adulthood. Antipas grew up in Rome as part of the political arrangements his father made with Augustus. Herod the Great had sent several of his sons to Rome for education, partly out of genuine respect for Roman culture, partly as a political gesture of loyalty to the emperor. Antipas grew up, therefore, more Roman than Jewish in cultural terms, fluent in Latin and Greek, familiar with the theater, with banquets, with monumental architecture, with the consumption patterns and entertainment of the imperial aristocracy. When he returned to govern Galilee and Perea as tetrarch, not as king, because the Roman Empire had fragmented his father's territory among several heirs, rather than granting the royal title to any of them. He was a man who had one foot in each world and was completely at ease in neither. The Galilee that Antipas governed was a region of approximately 4,000 square kilometers, with a population estimated between 200 and 300,000 inhabitants, predominantly Jewish, but with a significant presence of Hellenized populations in the coastal cities and in the 10 cities of the Decapolis to the east. Perea, the region east of the Jordan, was less populous but strategically important because it included the trade route connecting Galilee to the south and because it contained the fortress of Machaerus. Antipas governed this territory for 41 years, from 4 before the Common Era to 39 after, making him one of the most enduring rulers in the political history of Herodian Judea. Antipas was married to the daughter of Aretas IV, king of the Nabateans, when he decided to become involved with Herodias. To understand the scandal that represented, you need to understand who Herodias was. She was the daughter of Aristobulus IV, who was the son of Herod the Great by Mariamne I, the Hasmonean wife whom Herod had loved, jealously controlled, and eventually had killed. That is, Herodias was a granddaughter of Herod the Great through the Mariamne line, the Hasmonean lineage, the lineage of historical prestige among the Jews, descendants of the Maccabees who had restored Jewish sovereignty in the 2nd century before the Common Era. And Herodias was married to Philip, not Philip the Tetrarch who appears on maps governing Iturea and Trachonitis, but another Philip, a brother of Antipas on the paternal side, who lived as a private citizen in Rome without any significant political title. What Antipas did was simple in execution and devastating in consequences. He fell in love with Herodias during a visit, persuaded her to divorce her husband and marry him, and broke off his marriage to Aretas's daughter. The Nabatean princess learned of what was being planned and managed to flee to her father's side before being formally repudiated, which added a layer of diplomatic humiliation to the religious transgression, because Aretas IV now had a personal reason for hostility beyond the territorial tensions that already existed between the two kingdoms. From the Roman perspective, the situation was politically complicated, but not a moral scandal. The Romans had a flexible view of marriage and divorce in the elite. From the standpoint of Jewish law, recorded in Leviticus chapter 18, verse 16 and chapter 20, verse 21, it was an explicit prohibition. A man was not to uncover the nakedness of his brother's wife. It was impurity. It was a direct transgression of the written Torah, not of rabbinic interpretation or oral tradition. It was clear text. John said exactly that. Luke chapter 3, verse 19 says that John rebuked Herod on account of Herodias, his brother's wife, and on account of all the evil things he had done. The formulation is important. It was not a political criticism of the ruler, not sedition or incitement to rebellion. It was a specific religious accusation based on a specific biblical text, publicly addressed to a ruler who needed legitimacy before the Jewish population in order to govern with any stability. Antipas was not merely inconvenienced by the personal criticism, he was being institutionally delegitimized by someone who mobilized crowds. The response was to imprison John. Mark chapter 6, verse 17 says that Herod had John arrested and chained in prison on account of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip, whom he had married. The fortress chosen was Machaerus. You need to grasp the scale of that place to grasp what John endured in those months. Machaerus stood on an isolated hilltop east of the Dead Sea, in the region that is modern Jordan, at an altitude of approximately 720 meters above sea level, with the valley of Wadi Zerkama'in to the north and steep precipices in other directions that made access difficult and escape practically impossible without internal complicity. The Jewish historian Flavius Josephus, in his Jewish Antiquities, Book 18, and also in his work The Jewish War, Book 7, mentions Machaerus several times as one of the best garrisoned fortresses of the region, originally built by one of the Hasmonean kings in the 2nd century before the Common Era, and rebuilt and expanded by Herod the Great as part of his territorial defense system. The fortress had an upper section with palatial facilities adequate to receive royalty. Herod the Great had built bathrooms, reception halls, courtyards. It was where Antipas stayed when visiting the region, and it had dungeons in the lower section, partially carved into the rock, dark, damp from the Dead Sea climate, with minimal ventilation. It was not a place of temporary detention. It was a place where political enemies were buried alive, enemies whom power could not kill immediately for reasons of calculation but was not willing to set free. John the Baptist was placed in exactly that position, too publicly prominent to be killed immediately without consequences, too politically inconvenient to be released. What is known of the period John spent in Machaerus comes from an extraordinary detail that rarely receives the attention it deserves in the popular narrative about John the Baptist. Matthew chapter 11, verses 2 to 6, and Luke chapter 7, verses 18 to 23, record that John from prison sent 2 of his disciples to Jesus with a question: "Are you the one who was to come, or should we expect someone else?" That question crosses 20 centuries with a force that loses no intensity with time. John the Baptist, the man who had publicly proclaimed Jesus as the Lamb of God, who had said before his own disciples that he was not worthy to untie the straps of Jesus' sandals, who had witnessed the sky open and the voice declare that Jesus was the beloved Son. This man, from within a stone dungeon on the shores of the Dead Sea, sent to ask whether Jesus really was the one who was to come. There was real doubt there. There was crisis. There was the concrete and physical weight of weeks or months in a dark cell, without seeing what was happening outside, without any visible miracle changing his specific situation, without any divine intervention freeing the prophet as prophets of Israel had been freed in previous stories. Peter was freed from prison by an angel in Acts chapter 12. Paul and Silas were freed by an earthquake in Acts chapter 16. John stayed, and the doubt grew with the weeks. The answer Jesus sent back did not solve John's logistical problem. He sent no soldiers to free the prisoner. He did not appear personally at Machaerus. He gave no guarantee of safety or promise of liberation. He sent a message quoting passages from the prophet Isaiah, specifically Isaiah chapter 35 verses 5 and 6, and chapter 61 verse 1. The blind see, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. And then he added a line that is simultaneously delicate and devastating. Blessed is the one who does not stumble on account of me. It was a response that implicitly acknowledged John's crisis. It was also a response that promised no liberation. Blessed is whoever does not take offense, which presupposes that there is reason for offense, that what is happening or not happening has the potential to bring down the faith of those who look closely. Immediately after John's disciples departed, Jesus spoke to the surrounding crowds about who had gone out into the desert to see. Matthew chapter 11, verses 7 to 15. And then came the declaration that defines John's position in the larger narrative. Truly, I tell you, among those born of women, there has not risen anyone greater than John the Baptist, no one greater. Not Moses, who spoke with God face to face on Sinai, who parted the Red Sea, who received the law on 2 tablets of stone. Not Abraham, who left everything for a promise he would not see fulfilled in his lifetime. Not Elijah, who stopped the rain for 3 years and 6 months over Israel, who confronted 450 prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel and called down fire from heaven, who ascended to heaven in a chariot of fire without passing through death. Not Isaiah, not Jeremiah, not Daniel, not any of the giants of the Hebrew prophetic tradition. John, the man who ate locusts and was rotting in a dungeon while Jesus made that public declaration. Yet whoever is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. This line that follows has been debated for 2 millennia without consensual resolution. Some interpreters read it as a contrast between eras or dispensations. John belonged to the era of promise, to the period of anticipation, and even being the greatest of that era, he represented a stage being surpassed by the inauguration of something new. Others read it as an affirmation of the ontological difference between human greatness, even the highest that is possible to be born with, like John's, and the reality of what the kingdom represents. Regardless of the theological interpretation, the narrative and human effect is disturbing, with a consistency that cuts across all readings. The greatest among those born of women was in a cell in Machaerus, with no prospect of liberation, with doubts that made him send messengers to ask whether he was on the right side. And he would remain there. Time passed within the walls of Machaerus with that specific slowness of detention that anyone who has ever been imprisoned for any reason recognizes, time that weighs differently when you do not choose to stay. Mark chapter 6 verse 20 adds a detail that humanizes Herod Antipas in a way that makes the story even more disturbing. The king feared John, knowing that he was a righteous and holy man, and kept him safe. The Greek verb syneterai suggests that Herod kept him protected, guarded him from some specific danger, and he was greatly perplexed. In Greek aporos, without a way out, without a solution. After hearing him, but even so, he heard him gladly. Herod summoned John for conversations. From the palace in the upper parts of Machaerus, he would send for the prisoner from the lower dungeons, sit down, listen to a man he had ordered chained, be disturbed by what he heard, and send him back to the cell. It is the documented portrait of a man who recognized the truth and was incapable of acting in accordance with it. A specific moral weakness that is not calculated villainy, but that produces consequences just as devastating, because inaction in the face of injustice is a form of participation in it. The pressure to kill John came from Herodias. Mark chapter 6, verse 19 says, "She had a grudge against John and wanted to kill him, but she could not." There was a barrier, which was Herod's reluctant protection. Herodias did not have the direct power to order the execution. She needed Herod, and Herod was not willing to take that step, not out of love for justice. The text is clear that Herod's motivation was fear and admiration, not principle. But in any case, Antipas's resistance created a timeline that Herodias did not control. She needed a moment in which Herod would be sufficiently vulnerable, sufficiently publicly committed, sufficiently unable to back down. The birthday banquet was that moment, the birthday banquet of Herod Antipas. Mark chapter 6, verses 21 to 28. To understand the mechanics of what happened that night, you need to understand what a royal banquet in the first century meant in the Greco-Roman context of Antipas's court. It was not a family gathering with home-cooked food. It was a first-order political event. Herod's guests were the great men of his court, probably the chief administrators of the territory, the high-ranking tax collectors, the scribes and legal advisors, the military tribunes, the chiliarchs, the commanders of 1,000 soldiers each, the senior officers of the military structure that maintained order in Galilee and Perea, and the leading men of Galilee, the local aristocracy, the men of land and money whose support or hostility could make governing easy or impossible. It was the kind of event where real politics happened informally, where alliances were consolidated or broken between the second and third cup of wine, where demonstrations of power and generosity were staged for an audience that knew how to read every gesture. The host needed to appear powerful, generous, self-assured. The word of a ruler at a banquet like that in front of those specific witnesses could not be undone without serious consequences to perceived authority. There was a social code at play that was as real as any written law, and in certain contexts more binding. There was wine, because Hellenistic banquets, the symposium that Rome had imported from Greek culture, were organized around wine and the entertainment that accompanied it. There was music, there were the speeches and toasts that structured the event. And then the daughter of Herodias entered. The text of Mark chapter 6 verse 22 calls her the daughter of Herodias herself. She danced, and she pleased Herod and those who reclined at table with him. Matthew chapter 14 verse 6 says that the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod. The text does not give this young woman a name in the Gospels. The name is provided by Flavius Josephus in his Jewish Antiquities, Book 18, chapter 5, verse 4. The name was Salome. Josephus mentions Salome in the context of her subsequent marriages. She first married Philip the Tetrarch, who was her uncle, and who was considered the most just of Herod the Great's sons, according to Josephus, and who died without children. She then married Aristobulus, prince of Chalcis. What Josephus's data suggests is that Salome was young, probably a teenager, on the night of the banquet. Salome's dance in the middle of the banquet hall pleased Herod to such a degree, or impressed him in a way that combined pleasure with the pressure of appearing generous before his guests, that he made a public oath. Mark chapter 6, verse 23, records the exact words, "Ask me for whatever you wish, and I will give it to you, up to half my kingdom." It was a well-known rhetorical formula in the ancient world. It appears in almost identical form in Esther chapter 5, verse 3, when King Ahasuerus makes the same offer to Esther after she approaches the throne without being summoned. It was an expression of performative, extravagant generosity, not necessarily a literal promise to divide the territory, but it was a public promise, made by a ruler before the chief men of his court, in public, before witnesses whose respect he needed. The promise could not be undone without humiliation. Salome left the hall and went to consult her mother. Herodias's request was unambiguous. She did not ask for land, did not ask for money, did not ask for political favors. She asked for something that had no material value, but that satisfied something that money and territories could not satisfy. "I want you to give me right now, on a platter, the head of John the Baptist." Mark chapter 6, verse 24. The girl went back in at once to the king. The text uses the verb "eiselthusa euthis," suggesting immediacy, urgency, without hesitation, and made the request, "I want you to give me immediately the head of John the Baptist on a platter." Herod Antipas, the man who heard John gladly, who knew that John was righteous and holy, who protected John from Herodias' wrath, was deeply grieved. The Greek text of Mark uses perilipos, meaning deeply sorrowed, filled with sorrow on all sides. It was real grief, not performative. Herod knew what he was about to do. He knew it was irreversible. He knew John was innocent of any crime that warranted death, and he did it anyway. Mark chapter 6, verse 26 explains why with a precision that is simultaneously mundane and devastating. Because of his oaths and because of his guests, he did not want to refuse her. Because of his oaths. Because of his guests. Not out of conviction, not out of personal anger, not out of calculated politics, out of social embarrassment. Because admitting publicly that he had made a promise he was not willing to keep was the kind of humiliation that a first-century Mediterranean ruler simply could not absorb without consequences to perceived authority. The men around the table, the tribunes, the court grandees, the leading men of Galilee, had heard the promise. They had heard the request. Now they were watching. The death of John the Baptist was the product of a specific convergence of factors that is rarely presented as such. Wounded ruler vanity, calculated conjugal opportunism, systematic moral weakness, and the cruel mechanics of how power functions when immediate public opinion weighs more than the life of an innocent person. The king immediately sent a speculator, the Greek word transliterated from the Latin speculator, which was a soldier with the functions of personal bodyguard and executioner for the ruler, a position that existed in the Roman court and which Herod Antipas had imported as part of the Hellenistic power apparatus he assembled in Galilee. The executioner went down to the dungeons of Machaerus with orders to bring John's head. The text of Mark chapter 6 verse 27 records the events with 4 consecutive verbs that have the cruelty of objectivity. He beheaded John in the prison. He brought his head on a platter and he gave it to the girl. 4 movements, no added drama, no description of the cell, no description of John's final moments, no detail about how the executioner executed. The narrative camera records the result, not the process. The girl gave the head to her mother, and there the scene inside the banquet hall ends. The text does not say what Herodias did when she received what she had requested. There is no description of emotional reaction, neither satisfaction nor horror, neither jubilation nor remorse. There is a silence in the texts around that moment that may be the silence of ancient narrative neutrality, which rarely describes characters' emotional states with the psychology that modern narrative has made standard. Or it may be that the absence of description is itself information, that there was nothing to describe beyond the obvious. The head of John the Baptist on a silver platter. It is the image that the Western imagination has fixed upon regarding this story with a persistence that crosses all aesthetic eras. Caravaggio painted Salome with the head of John at least twice, once with Salome with her back to the viewer, holding the platter carefully as if the weight were not physical but existential, and another in which John is portrayed with the aged features of Caravaggio himself after he fled Rome, accused of homicide, an autobiographical projection that art historians debate. Titian painted it, Klimt painted it, Beardsley drew it for Oscar Wilde's play, which transformed Salome into the passionate protagonist and John into the object of obsession, an inversion of perspective that the Catholic Church placed on the Index Librorum Prohibitorum. Richard Strauss's opera, based on Wilde's play, premiered in Dresden in 1905 and caused enough scandal for Mahler to be prevented from staging it in Vienna by the imperial family. This image, the head, the platter, the young woman, has accumulated layers of interpretation that it never asked for and that sometimes obscure what the original texts record. What the texts record is what happened outside the palace of Machaerus after the night of the banquet. When John's disciples heard, they came and took his body and buried it. Matthew chapter 14, verse 12. The passive voice is revealing, they took. They collected the body of a decapitated man, headless, and buried him. The texts do not say where, they do not say how many disciples came, they do not describe the burial, they do not record the lamentation. What they record is what came after that gesture. They went and told Jesus. That is the moment that closes one cycle and opens another in the gospel narrative. John's disciples, men who had followed a desert prophet long enough to be called his disciples, who had carried his message among the cities of Galilee and Judea, who had seen him baptize multitudes in the Jordan, who had carried the question from prison to Jesus and brought the answer back. These men went to where Jesus was, and they told him. Matthew chapter 14, verse 13 records Jesus' reaction with a restraint that is itself a form of communication. When Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there by boat to a desolate place by himself. He gave no speech. He called no meeting. He sent no words of comfort. He made no public declarations about John or about Herod. He took a boat, went to a desolate place by himself. He actively sought solitude. In a moment when all the narrative expectations of a significant event pointed in another direction. For any reader familiar with the patterns of the Gospels, this silence is absolutely thunderous. In the Gospels, Jesus weeps. John chapter 11, verse 35, is the shortest verse in the Bible in Greek. 2 words, edakryson ho Iesus. Jesus wept. And those 2 words are about the death of Lazarus. Jesus wept before the tomb of a friend. But upon receiving news of the death of the man he had called the greatest among those born of women, the man whose ministry had prepared the way for his own, the relative who had descended into the waters of the Jordan to immerse him, and who had heard the voice from heaven together with him in that moment, upon receiving news of that death. The text of Matthew does not record weeping. It records a boat and a desolate place. This silence has troubled readers and interpreters for 2 millennia. Some have read it as personal grief that needed privacy to exist. There was, if Luke's genealogy is correct, a family relationship between Jesus and John, and the death of a cousin, especially a cousin who had been the public forerunner of his own mission, would be a loss requiring space that a crowd could not provide. Others have read it as a deliberate demonstration of a pattern. The path of the prophet leads to the dungeon and the scaffold, and Jesus knew that what had happened to John was tracing the path he himself would walk. John's death was a rehearsal. And sometimes a rehearsal needs silence to be processed. Still, others have read the withdrawal as strategic prudence. Herod had just killed a prophet who inconvenienced power, and Jesus was the next person on the list of those who inconvenienced power. So geographic distance from Antipas and Machaerus was a sensible survival measure. The text does not explain the silence. That is important. In other moments in the Gospels, Jesus explains his movements and motivations with considerable openness. Here he does not. The silence remains without resolution. Matthew records that the crowd followed Jesus on foot from the towns when the boat set out. Even in seeking solitude, Jesus was followed. And then, what Gospel readers know as the multiplication of loaves and fish takes place. 5 loaves and 2 fish, feeding 5,000 men besides women and children, with 12 baskets of leftovers. Matthew chapter 14, verses 15 to 21. The narrative moves from John's death to the greatest multiplication miracle in the Gospels within a matter of paragraphs, with no explanatory transition. The sequence is not accidental. It is a deliberate juxtaposition that places 2 events in permanent tension. What human power does to those who speak the truth, and what happens when what lies beyond human power acts on the same stage. There is a historical record about the death of John the Baptist that is not in the Gospels, and that scholars treat with special attention precisely because it is independent of the Christian tradition. Flavius Josephus, the Jewish historian born around 37 of the Common Era, a few years after John's death, and who wrote his Jewish Antiquities probably around the 90s, mentions John the Baptist in the Antiquities, Book 18, Chapter 5. Josephus describes John as a good man who commanded the Jews to practice virtue, exercise justice among themselves, and piety toward God, and to approach baptism. He says that John's baptism would be acceptable to God, not to ask forgiveness for sins, but for the purification of the body, with the soul already purified beforehand by justice. Josephus says that John's words attracted great crowds, and that Herod, fearing that John's eloquence might lead the people to some form of sedition, decided it was better to kill John than to risk the problem, and that John was killed at Machaerus. Josephus's interpretation of Herod's motivation is political, the fear of sedition, while the Gospels emphasize the personal and domestic motivation involving Herodias. Scholars generally treat the two versions as complementary, not contradictory. In a ruler like Herod Antipas, the boundary between political and personal was porous. A public figure like John, capable of mobilizing crowds, who had publicly criticized the ruler's marriage, represented both a political threat and a personal discomfort. Both motivations may have operated simultaneously. The central fact that both sources confirm is the same. John was imprisoned by Herod and executed at Machaerus. Josephus also mentions a political consequence that the Gospels do not record: the war that followed between Herod Antipas and Aretas IV. Aretas's daughter had fled before being formally repudiated. The father waited. Some years after John's death, probably around the year 36 of the Common Era, Aretas attacked Antipas's territories, and Antipas's army was completely destroyed in the battle. Josephus records that this defeat was interpreted by some Jews as divine punishment for what Antipas had done to John. It is a providential reading of a documented geopolitical event. The battle happened. Antipas's army was destroyed. Rome was asked by Antipas to intervene, but the process was interrupted by the death of Emperor Tiberius, which preserves the public memory that what had happened at Machaerus carried a moral weight that people were not willing to let be swept away by the official narrative. The life of Herod Antipas after his defeat by Aretas continued deteriorating in a way that has the structure of Greek tragedy, in which the protagonist is destroyed by the forces he himself set in motion. Herodias, the woman for whom Antipas had broken his first marriage, had diplomatically humiliated Aretas IV and had ordered the killing of a prophet, was the one who finally brought about Antipas's definitive ruin. Herodias's nephew, Agrippa I, son of Aristobulus, Herodias's brother, obtained from Emperor Caligula, who had succeeded Tiberius in 37 of the Common Era, the title of king over the territory of Philip the Tetrarch, who had died without children. Agrippa I was king. Herod Antipas, who had governed Galilee and Perea for more than 4 decades, was only tetrarch. Herodias pressured Antipas to go to Rome to ask Caligula for the title of king. Antipas went. Agrippa preceded him with accusations to the emperor. Antipas had accumulated armaments sufficient to equip 70,000 soldiers. He was in secret negotiations with the Parthians, enemies of Rome. Caligula summoned Antipas, who could not fully refute the accusations. The emperor exiled Antipas. Some manuscripts of Josephus say it was to Gaul, others say Spain, and confiscated his territories, which were given to Agrippa. Herodias went along into exile by her own choice, according to Josephus, refusing Caligula's offer to preserve her own estate out of consideration for her brother Agrippa. The man who had ordered the killing of John the Baptist died in exile, without title, without territory, without the kingdom he had gone to Rome to seek. The name of Salome appears one last time in Josephus, married, widowed, married again, and disappears from the historical record. The name of Herodias does not appear again after the exile. The fortress of Machaerus survived the fall of Antipas. continued to be used during the period of direct Roman rule over Judea after Agrippa I died in 44 of the Common Era and the region returned to being administered by Roman procurators. It was destroyed by Roman forces in the year 71 of the Common Era, during the military operations that followed the fall of Jerusalem in the year 70. Flavius Josephus describes the siege of Machaerus in the pages of the Jewish War as an episode in which the defenders negotiated a surrender after direct threats. The ruins of what was Machaerus still exist in modern Jordan, on a hill that archaeologists from the University of Granada and other institutions have been exploring in recent decades, identifying structures compatible with Josephus's descriptions, including prison facilities at the lower level of the fortress, exactly where the text of Mark locates John the Baptist's cell. John's body was buried by his disciples in a place the texts do not identify and which no archaeological evidence has located with certainty. The Christian tradition has preserved claims of relics of John in multiple locations: a right hand in Georgia, bones in Bulgaria, the head in places that the Catholic tradition identifies in ways distinct from the Orthodox and Syriac traditions. None of these claims has solid historical verification. What exists concretely are the texts, the records, the story that crossed 20 centuries in copies and translations and arrived intact in its fundamental strangeness. Because the fundamental strangeness of the story of John the Baptist is not the supernatural element, it is the human element. It is the sequence of weaknesses and calculations and grudges that produced an unjust execution on a night that began with music and wine and dance. It is the fact that the greatest among those born of women, in the declaration of the one who had come to inaugurate the new era, died because of a birthday party. It is the silence of Jesus in a situation where the narrative logic expected speech. It is the absence of intervention in a situation where religious logic expected a miracle. These absences are the heart of the story, and any honest narrative about the death of John the Baptist needs to stay with them, rather than dissolving them prematurely in an interpretation that pacifies what should not be pacified. Because what happened at Machaerus was not a test with a correct answer at the end. It was an execution of a man who had spoken the truth for an audience that did not want to hear it. Executed by a ruler who knew it was a lie but did not have the strength to be honest when honesty cost something. While John rotted in a cell in the fortress of Machaerus, Herod Antipas governed, held parties, received honors, and exercised the kind of power that first-century men recognized as real. One was imprisoned, the other was on the throne. And yet it is the name of the prisoner that has crossed 20 centuries. The name of the ruler is remembered only because he ordered the death of the prophet. That is not religious consolation. It is a pattern documented in history with disturbing regularity. The power that silences a voice rarely succeeds in silencing what that voice set in motion. Herod did not know that by ordering John's execution, he was ensuring that the story would be told forever. Sometimes censorship is the best amplifier. The head was delivered on a platter. The body was buried by the disciples. Jesus withdrew in silence to a desolate place, and the world kept turning as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something always happens when a man who refuses to lie is killed by a man who refuses to hear the truth.